1937, federal interviewers arrived in Mississippi to record the life of a woman no one believed could still be alive. Mother Adalia, age 1 or 12, the oldest formerly enslaved woman ever documented. They expected a harmless old survivor. Instead, the moment they opened her ledger, every man in that room froze. Page after page listed deaths, overseers, landowners, a respected black businessman, each name written in the same steady hand. No one understood how she lived this long, how she hid these acts for nearly a century, or why none of her victims ever saw her coming. The Bellamy family once dismissed her as powerless, a girl too small to fight back. That arrogance is the only reason their dynasty ended in a single night. But the ledger didn't explain how she killed them, only that they all died after crossing her path. What happened during those 112 years that turned an enslaved girl into a mystery no historian can explain. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The dirt road stretched ahead of Ezekiel Ward like a ribbon of rust-cold clay, cutting through pine woods so dense they swallowed the morning light. His leather satchel weighed heavy against his hip, stuffed with interview forms and half-filled notebooks documenting the lives of former slaves across Mississippi. 3 weeks on the road, 3 weeks of stories that started to blend together. Cotton fields, auction blocks, family separations. The same trauma rewoven through different mouths. His feet ached, his back complained with each step. At 32, Ezekiel felt decades older, carrying the weight of every testimony he'd recorded for the Works Progress Administration. The Federal Writers Project had seemed noble when he'd signed on, preserving black voices for history, but lately, the work felt like excavating graves with his bare hands. The humidity pressed against him like a wet wool blanket. Mosquitoes winded near his ears, sweat soaked through his white shirt, making the fabric cling to his shoulders. He paused to wipe his forehead with a handkerchief already damp from earlier use. The forest around him buzzed with invisible life, crickets, cicadas, things he couldn't name. But beneath the insect drone lay something else, a quiet that didn't feel natural. Mother Adelia's house appeared through the trees like something conjured from a fever dream. The cabin sagged at the edges, its weathered boards gray as old bone. Moss crept up the foundation. The tin roof had patches of rust spreading like bloodstains. A single chimney rose crookedly from the center, and the whole structure leaned slightly to the left, as if the earth beneath it had grown tired of holding it upright. The forest pressed close on 3 sides, leaving only a small clearing in front, where nothing grew except hard-packed dirt and struggling weeds. Ezekiel had asked directions at the general store in town that morning. The clerk, a light-skinned black man in his 50s, had given him a strange look. "Mother Adelia, you sure about that?" "It's my assignment," Ezekiel had replied. The clerk had drawn a rough map on brown paper, his hand hesitating before marking the final X. "Don't stay past sunset," he'd said. "Folks, don't travel that road after dark." Now, standing before the crooked cabin, Ezekiel understood why. The place felt wrong, not threatening exactly, just removed like it existed slightly outside the normal flow of time. He climbed the 3 wooden steps to the porch. They creaked, but held firm. A single rocking chair sat near the door facing the clearing. He raised his fist to knock. Doors open. The voice came clear and strong through the thin walls. Ezekiel froze, hands suspended midair. He hadn't heard anyone approach, hadn't heard footsteps inside, just that voice, steady as bedrock. He pushed the door open. The interior was dim, lit only by daylight filtering through a single window. As his eyes adjusted, Ezekiel made out sparse furnishings, a narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a small table with 2 chairs, shelves lined with glass jars filled with dried herbs. And there, in the same rocking chair he'd seen outside, except it wasn't outside anymore. He was certain of that, sat Mother Adelia. She was small, impossibly small, her frame shrunken with age until she seemed more spirit than flesh. But her spine was straight as a judge's gavel. Her hands rested on the chair's armrests without trembling, and her eyes were black as pitch and sharp as broken glass. They fixed on Ezekiel with such intensity that he felt pinned in place, a butterfly under examination. She wore a simple gray dress with a white collar. Her hair, thin and white, was pulled back into a tight bun. Her dark skin had the texture of well-worn leather creased with lines that mapped a century of living. "Come in then," she said. "Shut the door. You're letting the heat in." Ezekiel obeyed without thinking. He moved to the empty chair across from her, setting his satchel down carefully. His hands fumbled with the leather clasp. "You're from the government," she stated. Not a question. "Yes, ma'am. My name is Ezekiel Ward. I'm with the Federal Writers Project. We're collecting oral histories from former slaves," she finished. "I know what you're collecting. Question is whether you're ready to hear what I'm giving." Her directness threw him off balance. Most interviewees needed gentle coaxing, careful questions to help them open up. Many had never told their stories to a white person, or even to younger black folks who hadn't lived through bondage. But Mother Adalia spoke like someone who had already decided what would be said. Ezekiel pulled out his notebook and fountain pen. The familiar ritual steadied him. "If you're comfortable, I'd like to start with some basic information. Your full name, the plantation where you were enslaved, memories of your childhood." Boy. The single word cut through his prepared speech like a knife through cheesecloth. Mother Adalia leaned forward slightly. The rocking chair didn't move. The air in the room seemed to thicken. "You come to hear how long I lived? But the story is how many had to die for me to get here." Ezekiel's pen stopped moving. He stared at her, trying to process the words. His training told him to acknowledge the statement, redirect to factual questions, establish a comfortable baseline before diving into traumatic memories. His instinct told him to run. He did neither. Instead, he wrote her words down exactly as she'd spoken them, his handwriting shakier than usual. When he looked up, she was still watching him, studying him, measuring something he couldn't name. "I don't understand, ma'am," he said carefully. "Are you speaking metaphorically about the general suffering of I'm speaking plain English?" Her voice carried no anger, no emotion at all. "You want my story or not?" "Yes, ma'am." "Then listen close. I don't repeat myself." Silence settled between them. Outside, a bird called once and went quiet. Ezekiel waited, pen poised above paper. Mother Adelia's eyes never left his face. "Where are your people from?" she asked suddenly. The question startled him. My family? Your blood? Where are they from?" "My grandmother lived in Meridian," Ezekiel said. "She passed when I was young. My grandfather worked the railroad." "My mother." "Your grandmother's name?" Sarah Ward." Something flickered across Mother Adelia's face. Not recognition. Exactly. More like confirmation. "Sarah," she repeated softly. "That's a good name, a strong name." She settled back in her chair. "You got her eyes." Ezekiel had no response to that. He'd never met anyone who'd known his grandmother except his own mother, and she rarely spoke of the past. Mother Adalia closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again. "You'll do," she said. "You'll do just fine, ma'am, for hearing what needs to be heard." She gestured toward his notebook. "Right." And she began to speak. The sun hung low and orange when Ezekiel finally closed his notebook. His hand cramped from writing. His head throbbed with the weight of everything he'd transcribed. Mother Adalia had spoken for hours with only brief pauses, her voice never wavering, her memory sharp as shattered glass. She'd talked about the Bellamy plantation, about the mistress who taught her herbs, about the overseer with the whip scars across his knuckles, and she'd mentioned deaths, specific deaths, with details that made his stomach turn. "That's enough for today," she said, though he hadn't indicated he was leaving. "You'll come back tomorrow." Again, not a question. Ezekiel stood, his legs stiff from sitting. "Yes, ma'am. Same time. Come when you're ready to hear more." He gathered his satchel, tucking the notebook safely inside. At the door, he paused. "Mother Adalia, some of what you described. Are you certain your memory, boy?" Her eyes fixed on him again. "I remember every single one." The way she said it, calm, certain, almost peaceful, sent ice down his spine. He left quickly. Outside, the temperature had dropped. The clearing seemed darker than it should be, with sunset still painting the sky. Ezekiel walked fast down the dirt road, eager to put distance between himself and that crooked cabin. Voices drifted through the trees ahead. Two men stood near where the road widened, both elderly, both watching the path toward Mother Adelia's house. They went quiet when they saw Ezekiel approach. "You, the government man," one said. Statement, not question. "Yes, sir. You went to see her." "I did." The two men exchanged glances. The shorter one shook his head slowly. "That old woman sees death coming," he said. "Always has. My granddaddy told me. People who cross her path don't wake up right after." "She's just an old woman," Ezekiel said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Maybe." The taller man spat tobacco juice into the dirt. But folks around here don't go near that house past sunset, and they don't ask why. Ezekiel wanted to press for details, but something in their faces told him they'd said all they would. He nodded and walked past them, feeling their eyes on his back, until the road curved and trees blocked their view. The walk back to town took 40 minutes. By the time Ezekiel reached the boarding house where he was staying, full dark had fallen. He climbed the stairs to his room, set his satchel on the narrow bed, and sat down heavily. Then he opened his notebook and read what he'd written. Mother Adalia's words stared up at him in his own handwriting. "You come to hear how long I lived, but the story is how many had to die for me to get here." Ezekiel closed the notebook. He didn't sleep well that night. The eggs were cold. Ezekiel pushed them around his plate with a fork, unable to muster appetite. Around him, the boarding house dining room hummed with morning conversation. Travelers discussing routes, salesmen comparing territories, a woman reading yesterday's newspaper aloud to her companion. Normal voices, normal concerns. He heard none of it. "You come to hear how long I lived, but the story is how many had to die for me to get here." The words circled his mind like vultures. He'd spent half the night reviewing his notes, the other half trying to convince himself he'd misunderstood. That Mother Adalia had been speaking in riddles, the way some elders did. That her sharp memory had simply preserved plantation folklore, ghost stories told to frighten children. But the details, the precision, the complete absence of embellishment. "More coffee, Mr. Ward." Ezekiel looked up. The boarding house owner, Mrs. Patterson, stood beside his table with the pot. She was a round woman with kind eyes and a habit of worrying over her guests like they were family. "No, thank you, ma'am." She frowned at his untouched plate. "You feeling poorly? That's the third morning you've barely eaten. Just preoccupied with work. That old slave woman you're interviewing." Mrs. Patterson lowered her voice. "Folks say she's touched. Been alive too long if you ask me. Mine goes funny when you get that old." Ezekiel thought of Adalia's razor-sharp gaze. Nothing about her mind seemed funny or touched. She's quite lucid, actually. Mrs. Patterson didn't look convinced. "Well, you be careful out there. That part of the county's got a strange feeling to it." She moved away to refill other cups, leaving Ezekiel alone with his cold eggs and circling thoughts. He checked his pocket watch. 8:30. He told himself he wouldn't return until afternoon, would spend the morning organizing his notes, maybe visiting the county courthouse to verify some of the plantation records Adalia had mentioned. Instead, he found himself pushing back from the table, gathering his satchel, and heading for the door. The walk to Adalia's cabin felt shorter in daylight. Ezekiel followed the same dirt road, past the same scraggly pines, through the same oppressive humidity that made his shirt stick to his back. But morning sun stripped away some of yesterday's dread. Birds called from the branches. A rabbit bounded across the path ahead of him. The world felt ordinary again until he rounded the final bend and saw the crooked cabin waiting. It looked exactly the same. Same sagging porch, same shuttered windows, same weathered wood that seemed too old to still be standing. But something about it made Ezekiel's steps slow, made the hair on his arms prickle despite the heat. He climbed the 3 porch steps, raised his hand to knock, doors open. The same words, the same clear, strong voice cutting through the thin walls before his knuckles touched wood. Ezekiel pushed inside. Mother Adalia sat in her rocking chair in the exact position as yesterday. Same gray dress, same white collar, same hands resting steady on the armrest. She didn't look surprised to see him, didn't acknowledge that he'd arrived 4 hours earlier than expected. "Sit," she said. He moved to the same chair as before, set his satchel down, pulled out his notebook and pen. His hands moved through the ritual automatically while his mind raced. "You didn't eat this morning?" Adalia observed. Ezekiel's pen paused. "How did you got the look." Her eyes studied him with that same intense focus, same look Sarah used to get when something troubled her deep hollow around the edges. There it was again. His grandmother's name. The casual familiarity that suggested knowledge Adalia shouldn't possess. "Mother Adalia," Ezekiel began carefully. "Yesterday you mentioned several deaths on the Bellamy plantation. I spent last night reviewing my notes and I want to make sure I understood correctly. Were you describing actual events or I'm describing murder?" She interrupted, plain and simple. "Don't dress it up with fancy words." The bluntness stole his breath. Ezekiel stared at her, searching for signs of dementia, confusion, anything that would explain this calm confession. He found nothing but certainty. Perhaps we should start from the beginning, he said weakly. Your childhood on the plantation, daily routines, the overseer's name was Caleb Marsh. Adalia's voice cut across his attempt at redirection. Big man, hands like hams, had scars across his knuckles from where he'd split them open, beating folks. Used to whistle when he walked the quarters at night, checking that everyone stayed put. She paused. He fell in the well on August 15, 1829. Broke his neck on the way down. Ezekiel wrote mechanically. Date, name, cause of death. His training demanded documentation even as his gut churned. It was accident, Adalia continued. That's what they called it. Stones gave way when he leaned over to draw water. Poor man just tumbled right in. Her lips curved slightly. Not quite a smile. Those stones had been loose for weeks. I made sure of it. The pen slipped from Ezekiel's fingers. It clattered against the notebook, leaving an ink blot across the page. You. He couldn't finish the sentence. I was 9 years old, Adalia said. Small for my age, invisible mostly. That's what saved me. Nobody watched the invisible ones close. She leaned forward slightly. Caleb Marsh liked to visit the women's quarters after dark, liked to pick the young ones who couldn't fight back. My mother tried to stop him once. Her voice remained steady, factual. He broke her arm in 3 places. Ezekiel felt sick. So I watched the well, Adalia continued. Studied how the stones sat, found the ones that were already cracked from winter freezing. Worked them loose bit by bit over 2 weeks. Always at night, always careful. Then I waited, her black eyes fixed on Ezekiel. Caleb liked his morning water drawn fresh. Liked to supervise, make sure we didn't slack. All I had to do was make sure I drew water the day before he did. Mother Adalia, he whistled on his way to the well that morning, she said. Same tune he always whistled when he came for the women. I was 10 feet away carrying laundry. He didn't even look at me. Just leaned over the edge, and the stones gave way, exactly like I knew they would. She paused. He stopped whistling real quick after that. Ezekiel's hands trembled as he picked up his pen. He needed to speak, needed to redirect this conversation towards something sane, something he could process. These are powerful memories, he managed. The trauma of slavery often creates narratives where, boy, the word cracked like a whip. Don't insult me by pretending I'm confused. I'm not suggesting. You think I'm telling ghost stories, mixing up what happened with what I wished happened. Adalia's gaze pinned him to his chair. I'll give you another one then, something you can check. She settled back, her expression distant as she pulled memory forward. Mistress Bellamy had a cousin, Margaret, visited twice a year from Charleston. Pretty woman, loved to ride. Adalia's voice took on a strange gentleness. She also loved her riding crop, used it on the house servants when they didn't move fast enough. Particularly enjoyed catching the children, said it taught them proper respect. Ezekiel wrote despite himself, despite knowing he should stop this, should leave, should report this to someone, anyone. But his hand kept moving across the page. Margaret fell from her horse in June of 1831. Adalia said horse spooked during a morning ride, threw her hard, broke her neck same as Caleb, though it took her longer to die. She tilted her head slightly. Do you know what spooks a well-trained horse, Mr. Ward? He couldn't answer, couldn't speak. A thorn, Adalia said softly. Small one pushed through a saddle blanket in just the right spot. At a whispered command, the horse recognizes. I worked the stables. See, knew every animal by temperament, and you get a fall that looks pure accident. This isn't, Ezekiel's voice cracked. He cleared his throat, tried again. You're describing deliberate acts of murder. Yes. Adalia showed no emotion. That's exactly what I'm describing. The silence stretched between them. Outside, a dog barked in the distance. Normal sounds from a normal world that felt suddenly very far away. Ezekiel forced himself to ask the question burning through his shock. Why? His voice came out. Why are you telling me this? Because somebody should know, Adalia said simply. Because I'm 112 years old, and when I'm gone, the truth goes with me unless I give it to someone who will hold it right. Her eyes searched his face. You asked why I did it. You want to understand. Yes. Protection. She said someone had to do what the law never did, what the law was never going to do. She gestured toward his notebook. Write that down. Make sure you get it exact, Ezekiel wrote, though his hand shook so badly the words came out nearly illegible. Margaret beat a 6-year-old girl unconscious 3 days before that ride. Adalia continued. Child named Ruth. Her crime was spilling tea on Margaret's dress. She survived, but her hearing never came back right. Adalia's voice remained calm, controlled. The Bellamys apologized to Margaret for the inconvenience. Nobody apologized to Ruth. So you killed her. So I protected the ones who couldn't protect themselves. Adalia met his eyes without flinching. Same as I did with Caleb. Same as I did with others whose names you'll hear if you keep listening. Ezekiel wanted to argue, to challenge, to demand proof. These weren't just elaborate fabrications. But something stopped him. Something in the way she spoke. Not boasting, not seeking absolution or judgment, just stating facts with the same tone she might use to describe the weather. And underneath his horror, underneath his shock, a small voice whispered that he believed her, every word. The library sat 3 blocks from Ezekiel's boarding house. He arrived as the sun broke above the pines, casting long shadows across the town square. His night had been sleepless. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Mother Adalia's steady hands and heard her calm voice describing murder like recipe. The door creaked as he entered. Mrs. Patterson looked up from her desk, surprise crossing her lined face. "Mr. Ward." She set down her teacup. "You're here early. I need to see the Bellamy plantation records." Ezekiel's voice sounded strange to his own ears. Too tight, too urgent. Death records specifically from the 1820s and 1830s. Mrs. Patterson's expression shifted. Her fingers drummed once against the desk. "Those records are in the archive room. May I ask what this is about?" "Research for my WPA assignment." She studied him with the quiet assessment of someone who had worked in this library for 40 years. Whatever she saw in his face made her stand. "Follow me." The archive room smelled of dust and aging paper. Mrs. Patterson pulled a heavy ledger from a shelf, blowing away accumulated grime. She set it on the reading table with a solid thunk. Bellamy family records, 1820 through 1840. She hesitated, one hand still resting on the leather cover. "Mr. Ward, whatever you're looking for in here. Sometimes the past is better left alone. I need to verify dates," Ezekiel said. Mrs. Patterson nodded slowly. She left him alone with the ledger. Ezekiel opened it with trembling hands. The pages crackled. Faded ink documented births, marriages, property transfers. He flipped forward, searching, found the section marked Estate Incidents and Deaths. There, August 15th, 1829. Caleb Marsh, overseer, accidental death by drowning. Fell into well when stones gave way. Buried on estate grounds. Ezekiel's breath caught. He read it again. The date matched perfectly. He turned pages, heart hammering. June 23rd, 1831. Margaret Bellamy, cousin, visiting from Charleston. Accidental death. Thrown from horse during morning ride. Sustained fatal injuries to neck and spine buried in family plot. The words blurred. Ezekiel gripped the table edge until his knuckles went white. She had told the truth. Every detail aligned. He spent 2 hours in that archive room cross-referencing every death Adalia had mentioned. Every single one appeared in the records. Every date matched. Every cause of death listed as accident or natural causes. But now he knew better. Mrs. Patterson found him staring at the ledger when the morning sun streamed through the high windows. "Did you find what you needed?" she asked quietly. Ezekiel closed the book. "Yes, Mr. Ward." She waited until he looked at her. "That old woman you're interviewing, Mother Adalia, my grandmother used to say she was touched by something. A pause said folks who crossed her tended to meet unfortunate ends. Your grandmother knew her, knew of her. Everyone did back then." Mrs. Patterson's voice dropped lower. "My grandmother said to give Mother Adalia wide berth, said she had ways of settling accounts that couldn't be proven, but couldn't be denied either." Ezekiel stood on shaking legs. "Thank you for your help." "Be careful," Mrs. Patterson called as he left. By noon, Ezekiel stood outside Adalia's cabin again. The humid air pressed against his skin. His satchel felt heavier than it should, weighted with terrible knowledge. The door stood open. Mother Adalia's voice drifted out before he could knock. "Come in, child. Been expecting you since sunrise." He entered. She sat in her rocking chair, hands folded in her lap, looking exactly as she had every other visit, as if she hadn't confessed to murder, as if the world hadn't tilted on its axis. "You went to verify," Adalia said, "not a question. Yes, found what you needed to find." Ezekiel set his satchel down, pulled out his notebook. His hands no longer trembled. Shock had burned through to something else, something colder and more focused. Every death you described is documented exactly as you said. Of course it is. Adalia's expression didn't change. I don't lie about what I've done. No point to it. Then let's continue. Ezekiel uncapped his pen. You were telling me about the people you protected. Protected? Yes. Adalia leaned back, her chair creaking. There was a woman named Hannah, field hand, strong as any man, but gentle with the little ones. Master Bellamy took a shine to her, if you understand my meaning. When she fought him off, he had her whipped 20 lashes and sold her oldest boy downriver. Ezekiel wrote, his jaw tight. Hannah tried to hang herself 2 days later, Adalia continued. We cut her down in time, but she wasn't the same after, just hollow. So I made sure Master Bellamy got a fever that wouldn't break. Simple thing. Mushrooms that look safe but cook your insides slow. Took him 3 weeks to die. You poisoned him. I removed a threat. Adalia's voice remained steady. Hannah lived another 40 years, died free in 1874 with her remaining children around her. Tell me which death mattered more. Ezekiel had no answer. There was a cook named Patience, Adalia said. She taught me about herbs, about which ones healed and which ones harmed, and how you couldn't always tell the difference by looking. She understood what I was doing, though we never spoke it plain. She helped you. She taught me. Others did too. Adalia smiled faintly. You think I worked alone all those years, child? We had a whole network. Women passing knowledge like receipts, how to slip certain routes into food, how to weaken support beams, how to make sure accidents happen to the right people. The revelation struck Ezekiel like a physical blow, a network. 6 of us on the Bellamy plantation, more on neighboring estates. We protected each other, protected the children, especially. Adalia's eyes grew distant. White folks never suspected. Why would they? We were just house servants, field workers, cooks, invisible, harmless. How many died on the plantation? Adalia considered 14 that I did myself, maybe 20 more that the others handled. Hard to say exactly. We didn't keep count like it was something to be proud of. We just did what needed doing. Ezekiel's pen raced across the page. His mind spun with implications. This wasn't just one woman's vendetta. This was organized resistance, a shadow war fought by the powerless against their oppressors. Despite everything, despite the horror of what he was hearing, he felt something shift inside him, a grim satisfaction. These women had fought back when no one else would. They had protected each other using the only weapons available to them. Maybe this story could change how people understood slavery, could reveal the hidden strength and resistance that existed even in the darkest times. Mother Adalia, he said carefully, when did you stop? After emancipation came. Surely. Stop. Her laughter cut him off, sharp and sudden. Child. You think it ended there? Ezekiel froze. His pen hovered above the page. I didn't stop when freedom came, Adalia said. Her smile faded. Freedom didn't change what needed changing. Didn't make the world safe for folks like us. Different names, different faces, but same evil wearing new clothes. What do you mean? I mean, I've been alive 2 years, she said quietly. And I've been killing people who deserve killing for 90 of them. The words hung in the air between them. Outside, psychists began their evening chorus. The light through the window shifted toward orange. Ezekiel's throat went dry. 90 years, give or take. Adalia's black eyes fixed on him with that terrible clarity. You want to know the full story? Then you'd better prepare yourself because the plantation was just the beginning. He opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. How many? How many? What? How many people have you killed? Mother Adalia tilted her head, considering. Never counted exact, but if you're asking for a number, she paused. More than 40, less than 100, somewhere in that range. The notebook slipped from Ezekiel's fingers and hit the floor. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the quiet cabin. Tomorrow, Adalia said gently, we'll talk about Reconstruction, about the night riders who came looking to put freed folks back in their place, about the men who thought lynching was entertainment. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. About how I made sure some of them ropes got used on the right necks. Ezekiel couldn't speak, couldn't move. Go home, child, Adalia said. Rest. You'll need your strength for what comes next. Evening fell as Ezekiel walked back through town. The moon rose huge and orange above the tree. His feet moved automatically while his mind reeled. More than 40 people, less than 100, spanning 90 years. Mother Adalia wasn't just a survivor of slavery. She was something else entirely. Something the world had never documented because no one had thought to look, to ask, to listen. And now he carried her confession in his notebook. Every word, every name, every justified murder and calculated act of revenge. What was he supposed to do with this knowledge? Expose her as a serial killer? Honor her as a resistance fighter? Both felt wrong. Both felt incomplete. The central question hammered through his skull with each step. In a world that had denied justice to black people for centuries, who was he to judge the methods they used to survive? Tomorrow he would return. Tomorrow he would hear more. And with each confession, the weight of his decision grew heavier. The moon climbed higher. Ezekiel walked on, his shadow stretching long behind him. The sky still held the purple gray of early morning when Ezekiel arrived at Mother Adalia's cabin. He hadn't slept, hadn't eaten. The clear throat weight of yesterday's revelations had kept him pacing his boarding room until the first birds began singing. He needed to understand how a child became capable of such calculated violence where it started. What shaped her into something the world had no name for? The door stood open again as if she'd known he would come. Couldn't stay away, Adalia said from her rocking chair. Good means you're ready to hear it proper. Ezekiel entered without speaking, set his satchel down, opened his notebook to a fresh page. Tell me about the beginning, he said. Before the first death, when you were still just a child. Adalia's expression shifted, something almost like pain crossing her weathered features before settling back into that unsettling calm. Just a child, she repeated softly. Never was just a child, Mr. Ward. Not on Bellamy Plantation. Not anywhere a black child was born into bondage. She paused. But I'll start where you're asking. Back when I was 6 years old, and still believed the world might have mercy in it. She closed her eyes, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the cadence of someone stepping back through decades. Bellamy Plantation sat on 300 acres of Mississippi Delta land, cotton fields stretching farther than a child's eyes could see. 200 souls working that land, men, women, children, all. Master Jacob Bellamy owned every one of us like we were livestock, bought and sold and bred for profit. Ezekiel wrote quickly, his pen scratching across paper. I was born in the quarters in 1825. My mother died bringing me into this world, so I never knew her touch. An older woman named Aunt S raised me along with 6 other motherless children. We slept on straw pallets, 4 to a pallet, in a cabin with walls so thin you could see daylight through the cracks. Adalia opened her eyes, fixing Ezekiel with that penetrating stare. You want to understand what made me? Start there. Start with waking before dawn every day of your life to the sound of the overseer's horn. Start with watching children younger than me picking cotton until their fingers bled. Start with knowing that any adult could be sold away at any moment and you'd never see them again. I'm sorry, Ezekiel said quietly. Don't apologize. Just listen. Adalia's tone remained steady. When I was 6, Mistress Elizabeth Bellamy took notice of me. Said I had quick hands and a quiet disposition. Pulled me from field work to serve in the big house. Other children thought I was lucky. They were wrong. She shifted in her chair, the wood creaking beneath her. Mistress Bellamy taught me everything. How to fold linens with hospital corners. How to serve tea without making a sound. How to be invisible even when standing right beside her. A pause. And how to prepare her medicines? Ezekiel's pen hesitated. She taught you medicine. She taught me herbs. Adalia corrected. Mistress Bellamy suffered from headaches and stomach troubles. Fancied herself a healer like her mother before her. Had a whole still room full of dried plants, tinctures, oils. She'd bring me in there and show me which herbs calmed nerves, which ones settled stomachs, which ones brought sleep. She trusted you with that knowledge. She didn't see me as capable of using it against her. I was just a Negro child, too simple to understand, too obedient to question. Adalia's laugh was bitter. White folks' blindness was always their weakness. They never imagined we were watching, learning, remembering every single thing they taught us. Ezekiel wrote faster now, sensing the shape of what was coming. I learned fast, Adalia continued. Learned which plants healed and which ones harmed. Learned that foxglove could slow a racing heart or stop it entirely depending on the dose. Learned that nightshade looked almost like blueberries if you didn't know better. Learned that some mushrooms caused fever and vomiting that mimicked natural illness. She taught you poison. She taught me plants. I learned what they could do. Adalia's voice remained clinical, detached. By the time I was 8 years old, I knew more about killing through medicine than most doctors knew about healing. The morning light strengthened outside, casting long shadows across the cabin floor. But knowing isn't the same as doing, Ezekiel said carefully. No, it isn't. Adalia fell silent for a long moment. The doing came later, came from necessity. Tell me. She took a slow breath. When she spoke again, her voice had changed, carrying a weight that made Ezekiel's chest tighten. There was a boy named Samuel, 9 years old, sweet child, always singing while he worked. His mother was a house servant like me, and his father worked the fields. Samuel was assigned to tend the chickens and collect eggs every morning. Adalia's hands gripped the arms of her rocking chair. One morning, Samuel came back from the hen house with only half the eggs he should have had. Said a fox must have gotten in during the night. The overseer, man named Garrett, didn't believe him. Called him a liar and a thief. Said he'd been eating the eggs himself. Ezekiel's stomach nodded. He knew where this was going. Garrett dragged that boy out into the yard in front of everyone. Adalia continued, her voice going flat. Stripped his shirt off and tied him to the whipping post. Then he beat Samuel with a leather strap until the child couldn't stand. 30 lashes for eggs that a fox had actually taken. We found the broken shells later. Dear God, Ezekiel whispered. God wasn't there that day. Adalia's black eyes were dry, but something terrible lurked in their depths. I watched from the big house window while Mistress Bellamy took her morning tea. She looked outside once, saw what was happening, and turned away. Just went back to her embroidery like a child wasn't being destroyed in her yard. What happened to Samuel? His back got infected. He developed fever. Died 3 days later in his mother's arms, crying for the pain to stop. Adalia's voice never wavered. His mother tried to kill herself after. We stopped her, but she was never right again, just empty inside. The cabin felt suffocating. Ezekiel forced himself to keep writing, though his hand shook. That night, I understood something. Adalia said, understood that no one was coming to save us. No law, no God, no mercy from heaven. If anything was going to change, we would have to change it ourselves, so you decided to act. I decided that Garrett needed to die. The words came out simple, final, and I decided I would be the one to do it. Ezekiel looked up from his notebook. You were 8 years old enough to know right from wrong, old enough to know that sometimes the only justice available is the justice you make yourself. Adalia leaned forward slightly. The next morning, Mistress Bellamy had one of her headaches. She asked me to prepare her usual tonic, willow bark and chamomile. But she also asked me to prepare a draft for Garrett, who'd complained of stomach troubles. You poisoned him. I altered his medicine. Adalia's distinction was precise. Added extract from water hemlock root, careful amount, enough to cause violent illness, but measured to look like natural food poisoning. Garrett drank it with his evening meal, and by midnight he was vomiting blood. By dawn, he couldn't breathe right. By noon the next day, he was dead. Adalia's expression didn't change. The doctor said it was bad meat. Master Bellamy cursed the kitchen staff but didn't punish anyone. Didn't want to lose more property. They buried Garrett in the white cemetery with full Christian rites. Ezekiel's pen had stopped moving. He stared at the woman before him, this ancient, terrible survivor who had committed her first murder before she'd turned 9 years old. Did you feel anything? He asked. Guilt, fear, satisfaction? Necessity, Adalia answered. That's all I felt. Like I'd done something that needed doing. Same as washing dishes or sweeping floors. The world was better with Garrett dead, so I made him dead. Simple as that. Nothing about this is simple. No, but it was necessary. Adalia settled back in her chair, and once I knew I could do it, once I understood that I had power, even as a slave child, everything changed. I wasn't helpless anymore. Wasn't just a victim waiting for the next cruelty. You became something else. I became someone who protected people when no one else would, Adalia said quietly. Over the next years, I watched and learned, studied the white folks' patterns, their weaknesses, their blind spots. Mistress Bellamy kept teaching me about herbs, never suspecting what I did with that knowledge. She gestured toward the window where morning had fully arrived. By the time I was 12, I'd killed 3 more people on that plantation: an overseer who raped women in the quarters, a slave trader who separated families for sport, a visiting cousin of Master Bellamy's who liked to burn children with cigars for fun. Her voice remained steady, clinical. Each death looked like accident or natural causes. Each one made the world a little bit safer for the people I loved. Ezekiel realized his hands were trembling. He set down his pen before he could drop it. "You felt no guilt at all?" "I felt tired." Adalia said, "Felt old before my time. Felt the weight of every life I took, even the ones that deserved taking." "But guilt?" She shook her head. "No, child. I saved my guilt for the people I couldn't protect. The ones who died because I wasn't fast enough or smart enough or brave enough. Those are the deaths that haunt me." The silence stretched between them. Outside, birds sang oblivious songs. "This is what the system created," Ezekiel said finally. "They made you into this. They tried to make me into nothing," Adalia corrected. "Into property without thoughts or feelings or will. But humans aren't made to be nothing. We adapt. We survive. We fight back with whatever weapons we can find." She smiled faintly. "Mine just happened to be poison and patience." Ezekiel looked down at his pages of notes, a documentation of horrors that would never appear in any official history. His role had shifted from interviewer to confessor to something else entirely. Witness, maybe, or accomplice. The morning had turned toward afternoon without him noticing. His stomach growled, reminding him he hadn't eaten since yesterday. "I need to go," he said quietly. "Process this. Think. Tomorrow, we'll talk about adolescence." Adalia said about the secret network of women who taught me everything else I needed to know about how resistance spreads like seeds on the wind when people get desperate enough. Ezekiel gathered his notebook and pen with shaking hands, stood, made it to the door before turning back. "Mother Adalia, why are you telling me this?" Why now, after a lifetime of secrecy? She met his eyes with that penetrating stare. "Because someone needs to know. Someone needs to understand what we had to become to survive. And because you're the first person who ever asked me the right questions." A pause. "Besides, I'm 112 years old. Time I left a proper testimony." Ezekiel stepped outside into the afternoon air. The sky had clouded over, heavy and gray. A light drizzle began falling, cool against his skin. He walked slowly away from the cabin, his mind reeling with everything he'd heard. An 8-year-old child committing calculated murder. A system so brutal it transformed victims into killers, justice that could only come through poison and patience. The drizzle strengthened as he walked through the trees toward town. By the time he reached the main road, his shirt was damp. The clouds gathered darker overhead, promising a real storm. Ezekiel pulled his jacket tighter around himself, his notebook pressed against his chest, filled with confessions that would shake the foundations of how slavery was understood and remembered. Behind him, thunder rumbled low across the delta. He walked faster as the rain increased. By the time the boarding house came into view, water ran in rivulets down his face. He couldn't tell if the moisture on his cheeks was rain or tears. The storm broke fully just as he reached the porch. Ezekiel stood under the overhang, watching sheets of rain sweep across the town, and tried to decide whether he was documenting history or becoming complicit in something far more complicated than he'd ever imagined. The morning after the storm arrived, cold and clean, Ezekiel had barely slept, listening to rain hammer the boarding house roof while his mind replayed images of an 8-year-old girl measuring poison. When dawn finally came, he dressed with trembling hands and skipped breakfast entirely. The walk to Adalia's cabin felt different today. The storm had washed everything fresh, leaving puddles that reflected a pale blue sky. Birds sang louder than usual. The world looked innocent, scrubbed clean, a stark contrast to the darkness he was documenting. When he knocked, Adalia's voice called out immediately, "Come in, child, 'tis almost ready." Ezekiel pushed open the door and stopped. Mother Adalia stood at her small stove, heating water in a dented kettle. 2 chipped cups sat waiting on the table. She'd never offered him anything before. "Sit," she said without turning. "You look like you didn't sleep." "I didn't." Ezekiel lowered himself into the chair, setting his notebook down carefully. Kept thinking about Samuel, about Garrett, about a child forced to become a killer. Adalia finished his sentence. She poured hot water over crushed mint leaves, releasing a clean, sharp smell. That's what I became. No point softening the word. She brought both cups to the table and sat across from him. The tea was simple but carefully prepared. Ezekiel realized this gesture meant something, an acknowledgement that he'd proven himself worthy of hearing more. Today I'll tell you about the others, Adalia said. The women who taught me that I wasn't alone. That resistance could be larger than one girl's revenge. Ezekiel opened his notebook, pen ready, his hand still shook slightly. It started when I was 17, Adalia began. Year was 1842. I'd been careful for years, acting alone, protecting people when I could. But one night I was out past curfew, gathering herbs near the creek, when I heard voices, women's voices, low and careful. How many? 4 of them, meeting in the dark near the washing stones. I recognized them all. Women from different parts of the plantation. They were talking about the new overseer, making plans. Adalia sipped her tea. I should have run, should have hidden. Instead, I stepped into their circle and said, "If you're planning to kill him, I can help." They didn't turn you in. No, they'd been watching me too. Notice the pattern of accidents that always seemed to protect our people. They'd suspected but couldn't prove anything. A faint smile crossed Adalia's weathered face. That night, I found my sisters. Ezekiel wrote quickly, capturing her exact words. What were their names? Clarissa. She worked in the big house kitchen and knew every white person's schedule down to the minute. Hannah, who tended the sick and understood poisons even better than I did. Ruth, who could read and write despite the laws against it. And Dina, who'd been afield in all her life and knew every inch of the plantation's grounds. Adalia's voice softened with memory. Together, we became something powerful. A resistance network, a protection network, Adalia corrected. Our purpose wasn't rebellion for its own sake. We weren't trying to overthrow the system. We knew that was impossible. But we could make the worst people disappear. Could create small pockets of safety for our families. She described how they met regularly under various pretenses. Washing clothes became their signal. Hanging certain colored fabric meant a meeting that night. Tending fires allowed them to stay up late without suspicion. Each woman brought different knowledge, different access, different abilities. Our first coordinated action came in the spring of 1843. Adalia continued. Master Bellamy's brother was visiting from South Carolina. He was a breeder, bought and sold enslaved people specifically for reproduction. Started targeting young girls in our quarters, 12 and 13 years old. Ezekiel's stomach twisted. What did you do? Hannah prepared a special meal for him. Said it was a delicacy from her grandmother's recipes. He ate it eagerly, wanting to seem sophisticated. By midnight, he was vomiting. By morning, he couldn't breathe right. The doctor said his heart gave out. Weak constitution. Adelia's eyes were hard. We made sure his heart stopped before he could touch any of our children. The tea had gone cold in Ezekiel's cup. He forced himself to drink anyway, needing something to ground him in the present moment. Over the next years, we prevented so much suffering. Adalia said, not just through killing. Sometimes we helped families escape north, created distractions during punishments, forged passes for temporary freedom. But when someone needed to die to protect our people, we didn't hesitate. Give me another example, Ezekiel said quietly. Adalia nodded. Summer of 1845, there was an auction coming. Master Bellamy planned to sell 12 people to pay gambling debts. Families would be separated, children torn from mothers. We couldn't stop the auction, but we could delay it. How? Clarissa discovered the sale documents were kept in Master Bellamy's study. Ruth could read well enough to understand their importance. Dina knew the overseer always made rounds at midnight, predictable as sunrise. Adalia's voice took on a rhythmic quality, like she was recounting an old story. We staged a barn fire, carefully controlled, dramatic enough to create chaos. While everyone fought the flames, Ruth slipped into the study and destroyed the documents. Without proper papers, the sale couldn't proceed legally, and the families stayed together another 6 months before new documents could be prepared. Some used that time to escape north through networks we'd connected with. Others had 6 more months with the people they loved. Adalia met his eyes. Was it worth the risk? The barn we burned? The chaos we created? I believe it was. Ezekiel wrote furiously, trying to capture every detail. His understanding of enslaved resistance had been limited to dramatic escapes and rebellions. This was something else entirely. Patient, strategic, invisible. You said white society never suspected enslaved women could plan like this, he said. How did you avoid detection for so long? Because they thought we were stupid. Adalia's laugh was bitter. They saw us as property animals that could speak. The idea that we could coordinate, strategize, outsmart them, impossible in their minds. We used their arrogance against them. She described how they cultivated reputations as simple, harmless servants, how they asked obvious questions to seem ignorant while gathering intelligence, how they pretended to believe in their own inferiority while planning their next action. By the time I was 25, our network had expanded to 3 neighboring plantations. Adalia said, we passed information through songs, through patterns and quilts, through which herbs we carried to market, created an entire language the white folks never understood. How many people did your network save? Hundreds over the years. Prevented beatings, stopped rapes, protected children, helped escapes. She paused. And we killed maybe 15 white people who were the worst offenders. Each death carefully planned, perfectly executed, never traced back to us. The number hung in the air between them. 15 lives taken, hundreds saved. The moral weight must have been crushing. Adalia interrupted. Every single death carried weight, even the ones that needed happening. We weren't monsters who enjoyed killing. We were people forced into impossible choices, doing what the law would never do. Ezekiel's pen scratched across the page. Outside, the afternoon was aging toward evening. Light slanted golden through the window. This continued through the 1850s, he asked. Through the 1850s and into the war years, we watched tensions rise between North and South, heard whispers of possible freedom. But freedom seemed so distant, so impossible. Adalia's voice grew quieter. We kept doing our work because we couldn't afford to wait for salvation. Had to save ourselves day by day, death by death. She described the approach of the Civil War, how uncertainty made white enslavers more violent, more paranoid, how the network adapted, became even more careful, how they prepared for multiple futures, not knowing which would arrive. Ezekiel filled page after page with her testimony. The chronology was becoming clearer now, a through line of resistance from her childhood through young adulthood. She'd been 15 when she killed her first person alone, 17 when she found her network. By her mid-20s, she was coordinating protection across multiple plantations. The woman before him wasn't a simple victim or a simple villain. She was something far more complex, a strategist born from necessity, a protector armed with poison, a leader who emerged from the absolute bottom of society's hierarchy. I need to understand something, Ezekiel said carefully. When you killed these people, the overseers, the traitors, the visiting relatives, did any part of you enjoy it? Adalia was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice carried a terrible honesty. No. I felt satisfaction sometimes, seeing justice served, felt relief when a threat was removed, but enjoyment never. Each death diminished me a little, even the necessary ones, made me harder, colder, more distant from the girl I might have been in a different world. She looked down at her weathered hands. The work needed doing, so I did it, that's all. The light outside had shifted to late afternoon gold. Ezekiel realized they'd been talking for hours, his hand cramped from writing, his mind reeled from processing decades of carefully orchestrated resistance. He began gathering his notebook and pen, preparing to leave. His thoughts were already jumping ahead to tomorrow's session, to the war years, to Reconstruction, to whatever came after. Adalia stood when he did, walked him to the door, as she always did. But this time she placed one hand on his arm, stopping him at the threshold. War came, but freedom came slower, she said softly. Ezekiel met her eyes, seeing shadows of things she hadn't yet revealed. He nodded once, then stepped outside into the evening air. The walk home felt longer than usual. The clearing sky above him held streaks of pink and orange. Everything looked beautiful and peaceful, another lie that the world told about itself. The morning arrived with uncommon gentleness. Sunlight filtered through thin curtains in Ezekiel's boarding room, and for once he'd slept without nightmares of plantation ledgers and poisoned wells. He dressed quickly, ate a breakfast of cornbread and coffee, and walked the familiar path to Adalia's cabin with something approaching eagerness. She was waiting on the porch this time, unusual for her. Usually, she remained inside until he knocked. Today, she sat in her rocking chair, hands folded in her lap, face turned toward the rising sun. "You're ready for what comes next," she said. "Not a question." Ezekiel climbed the steps and settled into his usual seat. I want to understand what happened after emancipation, after the war ended, and you were legally free. Adalia's smile was thin. Legal freedom and actual freedom weren't the same thing, child. You know that I do, but I need to hear your experience of it. She nodded slowly, approving his directness. Then she began. When the war ended in 1865, I was 38 years old. I'd spent my entire life on Bellamy Plantation, or nearby. Didn't know any other world. The announcement came that we were free, and people celebrated, crying, dancing, praising God. Her voice remained steady, controlled, but I knew better than to trust words on paper. Ezekiel wrote carefully, capturing her exact phrasing. The network disbanded at first. We thought maybe we wouldn't need it anymore. Maybe the law would finally protect us instead of hunting us. Adalia's laugh was dry. We were wrong, of course. Within months, white vigilantes were terrorizing black communities. Former enslavers became employers who paid starvation wages and enforced their will with violence. The structures changed names, but not nature. She described transitioning into work as a midwife and herbal healer. Her knowledge of medicines and remedies, the same knowledge she'd used for killing, now primarily served to save lives. She traveled between small black settlements, delivering babies, treating fevers, teaching younger women her craft. The work was honest, Adalia said. Felt good to use my hands for healing instead of harm. Built trust in communities that desperately needed someone they could rely on. Became known as Mother Adalia, a title of respect, protection, but violence still surrounded them. Reconstruction brought temporary hope, then crushing disappointment as federal troops withdrew and white supremacist groups gained power. Adalia described specific threats: night riders who burned homes, employers who cheated workers, then beat anyone who complained, corrupt officials who looked away from atrocities. So I resumed my other work, she said simply, quietly, carefully, only when necessary. She recounted 3 incidents from the late 1860s. A landlord who routinely assaulted black women tenants, found dead from what appeared to be heart failure after drinking from a well Adalia had treated. A merchant who sold spoiled food to black families at inflated prices took sick from contaminated grain that somehow ended up in his personal stores. A county clerk who destroyed black voting registrations died in a fire that started mysteriously in his office. Each story carried the same pattern: careful observation, patient planning, precise execution, and outcomes that appeared accidental or natural. Ezekiel's pen moved across the page. He was growing accustomed to the rhythm of her confessions, the calm recitation of calculated deaths. But something had shifted in his understanding. These weren't acts of random vengeance. They were protective measures in a world where no other protection existed. Did others know what you were doing? He asked. Some suspected. The women I'd worked with during slavery recognized my methods, but most people just saw a kind midwife who happened to be present when bad men died. Adalia shrugged. I let them believe what they wanted to believe. The interview continued through mid-morning. Adalia rose at one point to fetch water, moving with surprising grace for her age. When she returned, she gestured toward an old trunk in the corner. You can look inside if you want. Kept records of my healing work. Thought someone should remember the lives saved, not just the lives taken. Ezekiel approached the trunk reverently. The wood was scarred and worn, metal hinges rusted, but functional. He lifted the lid carefully. Inside lay carefully organized bundles, dried herbs wrapped in cloth, small glass bottles containing tinctures and oils, a stack of letters bound with twine, and beneath it all, a leather-bound ledger. He lifted the ledger out, handling it like sacred text. The leather was soft with age, pages yellowed but intact. Opening it revealed neat handwriting, names, dates, ailments, treatments. Ezekiel began reading through entries from the 1870s. Each one documented Adalia's work. Sarah Johnson, difficult birth, mother and child survived. Thomas Green, infection in leg wound, treated with pus, healed fully. Mary Patterson, fever, administered willow bark tea. Fever broke 3rd day. The names rolled past, dozens of them, each representing a life touched by Adalia's knowledge and care. Then one name stopped him cold. Eunice Ward, his grandmother's name. Ezekiel's hands trembled slightly as he read the entry dated July 1873. Eunice Ward, age 22. Severe fever following childbirth. Baby girl healthy but mother declining rapidly. Administered fever, reducing herbs and fluids. Stayed 3 days. Fever broke morning of 4th day. Both mother and child survived. The baby girl would have been his mother. Ezekiel looked up at Adalia, who watched him with knowing eyes. You saved my grandmother's life. I saved many lives, she replied gently. But yes, Eunice Ward was one of them. Sweet girl, barely more than a child herself. The fever had her delirious, calling for her own mother, who'd passed years before. I stayed by her bedside, kept her drinking fluids, kept her body cool, wasn't sure she'd make it. Emotion flooded through Ezekiel. Gratitude, wonder, a sense of divine appointment. His entire existence depended on this moment in 1873, when Adalia chose to stay by his grandmother's bedside, when she used her knowledge to fight death instead of cause it. "I wouldn't exist without you," he said quietly. "None of us exist without someone else's choices," Adalia replied. "That's the truth of life. We're all connected by invisible threads. Who helped whom? Who saved whom? Who killed whom? The ledger balances in ways we can't always see." Ezekiel returned to the trunk, looking through more entries, found his grandmother's name 3 more times over the years, treating a child's crew, helping with another difficult birth, providing medicines during influenza outbreaks. Adalia had been a steady presence in his family's history, an unknown guardian whose actions rippled forward through generations. He felt chosen suddenly, not just assigned to this interview by bureaucratic chance, but selected by fate itself to hear and preserve Adalia's truth. She wasn't simply a former slave with a dark history. She was a protector, a healer, a woman who'd saved his bloodline. "This changes everything," Ezekiel breathed. "Does it?" Adalia's voice carried gentle challenge. "Or does it just help you see what was always true, that people are complicated, that the same hands that dealt death also gave life, that justice and mercy can exist in one person?" Ezekiel carefully returned the ledger to the trunk. His mind raced with new understanding. He could publish this narrative not as a criminal confession, but as a testament to courage and survival. Could frame her killings as necessary acts of protection in a lawless world. Could honor her as the hero she truly was. "I understand now," he said, returning to his seat. "I understand what you were doing. What you've been doing all along." Adalia's expression softened. The first truly warm look she'd given him. "Good. Then you're ready to hear the full truth." They continued through the afternoon, covering the years 1865 through 1880. Adalia described building community trust, earning her title of mother, becoming someone families called upon in their darkest hours. She detailed how she trained younger women in herbal healing, passing down knowledge that had been weaponized but could also save. She spoke of watching Black communities struggle to build something from nothing. Churches, schools, mutual aid societies, while white violence constantly threatened to destroy it all. The chronology became clearer with each session. 15 years of Reconstruction-era life marked by both healing work and protective killings. The numbers were smaller now, maybe 6 people eliminated during this period, each one a direct threat to vulnerable families. The work had shifted from constant survival to something more measured, more selective. Evening arrived gently, light going golden through the window. Ezekiel's notebook was filled with names, dates, testimonies. His heart felt full in a way it hadn't in years, full of purpose, gratitude, connection to something larger than himself. He packed his materials slowly, reluctant to leave this warm feeling behind. When he stood, Adalia stood with him. "Thank you," he said simply, "for saving my grandmother, for trusting me with your story." She nodded once, accepting his gratitude without false modesty. Ezekiel walked home through the evening air, feeling almost joyful. The world seemed brighter somehow, more meaningful. He thought about his grandmother, Eunice, how she'd lived into her 70s, raised 5 children, been known for her kindness, all because Adalia stayed by her bedside in 1873. At the boarding house, he ate dinner with uncommon appetite. Ham and beans, cornbread, greens. Everything tasted better tonight. He hummed to himself while eating, already planning how he'd frame tomorrow's interview. Early afternoon sunlight streamed through Adalia's window when Ezekiel arrived the next day. He carried his notebook with renewed enthusiasm, already imagining how he'd shape her narrative into something inspiring, something that honored her protective instinct and celebrated her role as guardian. Adalia was sitting in her usual chair, hands folded in her lap. When she saw his expression, bright, eager, hopeful, something shifted in her face. Not quite sadness, more like resignation. "You're looking pleased with yourself today," she observed. "I understand now," Ezekiel said, settling into a seat. "I see what you were doing, why you did it. You were protecting people who had no other protection. Is that what you think? Isn't it true?" Adalia was quiet for a long moment. Then she said gently, "Truth has sharp edges, child. You sure you want to keep cutting yourself on them?" Something in her tone made Ezekiel's enthusiasm falter, but he'd come too far to turn back now. "I want to hear everything, the full story." "All right then." Adalia shifted in her chair. "We left off in 1880. Let me tell you about the next 35 years. She described how life changed as Reconstruction collapsed completely. Federal troops withdrew. Black codes returned under different names. Violence became casual again, almost routine. Lynchings increased. Economic oppression tightened. The brief window of possibility slammed shut. I kept working as a midwife and healer. Adalia said, still delivered babies, still tended the sick. But I also kept doing my other work. Had to. The threats never stopped. They just took new forms. She recounted incidents from the 1880s and 1890s. A white merchant who cheated black farmers, then had them beaten when they protested, died from what looked like natural causes after drinking tea Adalia had prepared. A deputy sheriff who routinely arrested black men on false charges to feed the convict lease system took sick suddenly and never recovered. A landowner who burned tenant farmers' homes when they couldn't pay impossible debts suffered a tragic accident involving his own kerosene. Each story carried the familiar pattern: careful observation, patient planning, precise execution, deaths that appeared natural or accidental. Ezekiel took notes mechanically. The rhythm was familiar now. He told himself these were still acts of protection, still justified by the systemic violence surrounding them. The work changed some as I got older, Adalia continued. Wasn't just white folks threatening us anymore. Sometimes the danger came from inside our own communities. Ezekiel looked up from his notebook. What do you mean? I mean people who looked like us but worked against us. People who chose their own comfort over everyone else's safety. People who collaborated. The word hung heavy in the air. Adalia's voice remained steady. In 1912, there was a man named Thomas Reed. You heard of him? Ezekiel's pen stopped moving. Thomas Reed. The name pulled him instantly back to childhood, to stories his parents told. Reed had been a successful businessman, one of the few black men who'd built real wealth in the area. He'd owned a general store, employed local workers, donated to churches. When he died suddenly in 1914, the entire community mourned. Ezekiel's mother had cried at the funeral. He remembered because it was rare to see her weep. I know who he was, Ezekiel said slowly. Everyone respected him. He helped a lot of families. He did help some families, Adalia agreed at first. But success changed him. Or maybe it just revealed what was always there. She described Reed's rise in the business community, how he'd managed to thrive when most black entrepreneurs failed, how white businessmen actually welcomed him, included him in their circles, how he seemed to move between black and white worlds with unusual ease. Thought it was just his charm at first. Adalia said, his way with words. Then I started noticing patterns. She detailed how information about black community organizing would somehow reach white authorities before actions could be taken. How families planning to leave the area for better opportunities would suddenly face legal troubles. How workers attempting to negotiate better wages would find themselves blacklisted. All of it connected to conversations that happened in Reed's store or at his dinner table. I watched him for 2 years, Adalia said. Kept notes, followed the threads, finally confirmed what I suspected. He was feeding information to white supremacist groups, names of organizers, plans for protest, families who'd saved enough money to leave. He traded black people's safety for his own prosperity. Ezekiel's hands had gone cold. That can't be right. Thomas Reed was a traitor, Adalia finished, a collaborator who caused real harm. In 1913, 3 families tried to organize a work stoppage at the sawmill. Reed told management who the leaders were. Those 3 men disappeared, never seen again. Their widows and children had to leave the state to survive. The room felt smaller suddenly. Ezekiel's notebook lay open on his lap, but he couldn't look at it. I confronted him, Adalia continued. Went to his store one evening after closing, told him I knew what he was doing, offered him a chance to stop, to leave the area, to at least stop betraying his own people. What did he say? He laughed. Adalia's voice went flat. Said I was a foolish old woman who didn't understand how the world worked. Said collaboration was survival. Said he'd earned his place and wouldn't let ignorant field hands drag him down. Called me worse things than that. Told me if I spoke against him, he'd make sure I was committed to an asylum. Or worse, Ezekiel felt sick. So I acted, Adalia said simply. Made him tea, like I'd done for others. He drank it thinking I'd been frightened into submission. Died 3 days later. Doctor said it was heart failure. Everyone mourned him as a community pillar. Silence filled the cabin. Outside, birds sang. Inside, Ezekiel's entire understanding crumbled. You killed Thomas Reed, he said quietly. I did. Everyone loved him. My parents talked about him like a hero. They said his voice cracked. They said he was an example of what black people could achieve, that he proved we could succeed. He achieved success by selling out his own people, Adalia replied. By becoming a tool of oppression. That's not heroism. That's betrayal. Ezekiel's mind raced. He remembered the stories. Reed's generosity, his business acumen, his respect from both communities. How could all of that have been false? How could no one have known? Maybe you were wrong, he said desperately. Maybe you misunderstood what he was doing. Adalia's expression hardened. I wasn't wrong. I never acted without being certain. But you killed someone the community respected. Someone who respected doesn't mean righteous. Adalia cut him off. You think evil always looks like overseers with whips. Sometimes it looks like a well-dressed businessman. Sometimes it wears a smile and shakes hands and goes to church. That doesn't make it less dangerous. Ezekiel stood abruptly, unable to sit still. He paced to the window, stared out at nothing. His reflection in the glass looked haunted. How many others? He asked without turning around. How many other people did you kill who the community thought were good? Red was the only collaborator I eliminated, Adalia said. The others were white aggressors or black criminals who preyed on their own people. But yes, there were a few whose reputations were better than their actions deserved. Ezekiel turned back to face her. This changes everything, does it? Or does it just complicate what you wanted to believe? Adalia met his eyes steadily. You came here thinking you'd find a simple story. Oppressed woman fights back against oppressors. Heroic resistance, easy to celebrate. But real life isn't that clean. Real justice isn't that simple. You're talking about murder, Ezekiel said, voice rising. Not justice, murder. What's the difference when the law offers no justice at all? When the system protects betrayers and punishes victims? When collaboration with evil gets rewarded while resistance gets destroyed? Adalia's voice remained calm but intense. I made hard choices in a hard world. Did what needed doing when no one else would. Ezekiel sank back into his chair, head in his hands. The emotional elevation from yesterday had completely evaporated. In its place was confusion, horror, betrayal. Ezekiel didn't sleep. He lay flat on his back in the boarding house bed, staring at water stains on the ceiling. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Thomas Reed's face from old photographs. Kind eyes, confident smile, a man his parents had admired. A man, Adalia claimed, was a traitor. Dawn came gray and reluctant. Ezekiel rose mechanically, splashed water on his face, dressed. His hands trembled while buttoning his shirt. Mrs. Henderson called him for breakfast, but he couldn't eat. The thought of food made his stomach turn. He had to go back, had to understand. The walk to Adalia's cabin felt longer than usual. His feet dragged, the morning air hung thick and still. No breeze to relieve the building heat. Insects buzzed lazily. A crow watched him from a fence post, then flew away with 3 harsh cries. By the time Ezekiel reached the cabin, it was early afternoon. The sun beat down mercilessly, sweat soaked through his collar. Adalia sat in her rocking chair on the porch, waiting. She always seemed to be waiting, as if she could sense his approach long before he arrived. Her expression revealed nothing, neither welcoming nor hostile, just patient. Thought you might not come back, she said quietly. Ezekiel climbed the porch steps slowly. I almost didn't, but you did. Sit. He sat on the wooden step instead of his usual chair inside. Distance felt necessary. He needed space to breathe, to think. I have to ask you something, Ezekiel began. His voice came out rougher than intended. Did you ever question it? Your right to take lives? Adalia's hands rested still on the chair's armrests every single time. Then how could you keep doing it? Because questioning doesn't mean stopping. Not when lives depend on action. She looked past him toward the treine. I never killed for pleasure. Never killed from anger alone. I took what the world never offered us. Protection. Ezekiel turned to face her fully. But you decided who deserved to die. You made yourself judge and executioner. What gives anyone that right? The law gave me no rights at all, Adalia replied. The law said I was property. Then it said I was free, but offered no protection from violence. The law watched white men lynch black children and did nothing. The law rewarded collaborators like Reed and punished anyone who fought back. So I stopped waiting for the law to deliver justice it never intended to give. That's vigilante thinking. That's survival, Adalia interrupted, her voice sharp for the first time. You think I wanted to become what I became? You think I enjoyed watching people die by my hand? I carried every single death, felt every one of them. But I also saw the children who lived because a threat was removed, the women who escaped violence, the families who survived. Ezekiel's notebook lay closed on his lap. He couldn't bring himself to write yet. But Reed wasn't threatening children. He was causing disappearances. 3 men vanished because of information he provided. How many more would have followed if he'd continued? Adalia leaned forward slightly. Corruption inside a community is poison. It spreads. It destroys trust. It makes people afraid of their own neighbors. Reed wasn't just collaborating. He was teaching others that betrayal pays better than solidarity. So you killed him to send a message. I killed him to stop the harm he was causing and would continue to cause. The message was secondary. Adalia's eyes fixed on Ezekiel's face. You want me to apologize, to say I was wrong? I won't do that, but I also won't pretend it didn't cost me something. Every death took a piece of my soul. Every life I ended stayed with me. I remember their faces, their last words. The weight of that never lightened. Ezekiel rubbed his temples, feeling a headache building behind his eyes. How did you decide? How did you know when someone deserved to die? I didn't use the word deserve, Adalia said carefully. I asked different question. Is this person causing active harm? Will removing them save lives? Have other solutions been attempted? Can their damage be stopped any other way? I never acted quickly, never acted from emotion alone. I watched, I confirmed, I gave chances when possible. You gave Reed a chance, I did. Confronted him directly, told him to stop or leave. He chose neither. He threatened me instead. Told me he'd use his connections to have me locked away. That's when I knew he'd never stop. Adalia's voice softened. I'm not asking you to agree with my choices. I'm telling you what happened and why. You asked for truth. This is truth. Ezekiel stood abruptly, walked to the edge of the porch. He gripped the railing, knuckles white. I don't know what to do with this. I came here thinking I'd document resistance, heroic survival, something that could inspire people, but this, he gestured vaguely, this is so much more complicated. Real life usually is, Adalia observed. History isn't clean, justice isn't simple. People aren't purely good or purely evil. We're all just doing what we can with the choices available to us. But you had other choices. You could have what? Adalia's voice rose. Trusted the law that never protected us, appealed to authorities who considered us less than human, waited for white conscience to develop sympathy. How many would have died while I waited for justice that never comes? The question hung between them. Ezekiel had no answer. He'd spent his entire life navigating a world that offered limited choices that demanded constant calculation of risk and benefit. He understood the impossibility she described even as he recoiled from her solution. I need to know something else, he said after a long silence. Did you ever enjoy it? Any of it? No. The answer came immediately, firmly. I felt satisfaction sometimes knowing a threat was removed, that people were safer, but enjoyment never. Each death was necessary work, grim work, the kind that leaves scars. Ezekiel turned back to face her. And you never worried you might be wrong, that you might have misread a situation or acted too hastily? I worried constantly. That's why I was careful. That's why I took time to be certain. But yes, the possibility of error terrified me. What if I was wrong about someone? What if I killed an innocent person? Adalia's hands tightened on the armrests. That fear made me thorough, made me patient. I accepted I might make mistakes, but I never acted carelessly. The afternoon stretched on. Heat pressed down. Ezekiel felt exhausted, wrung out. His moral certainty had dissolved, replaced by uncomfortable questions with no easy answers. He wanted to condemn Adalia's actions outright. He wanted to celebrate her courage. He wanted to understand how someone could carry such weight for so long. He returned to the step, sat heavily. I don't know if I can write this story. I don't know how to present it without either villainizing you or excusing murder. Then don't do either, Adalia suggested. Tell it exactly as it happened. Let people wrestle with it themselves. Truth doesn't need your judgment, it needs your accuracy. Ezekiel finally opened his notebook. His hand shook slightly as he picked up his pen. You said Reed wasn't the only person the community respected. Who else? A preacher who used his position to abuse young girls. A teacher who reported families trying to organize for better conditions. A shopkeeper who diluted medicine he sold to black customers. Adalia listed them calmly. Their reputations protected them. Their smiles hid their harm. I saw through both. The pen moved across paper, recording, preserving, creating a permanent record of confessions that complicated every simple narrative Ezekiel had ever learned. They talked through the afternoon and into early evening. The sun began its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Shadows lengthened across the porch. Finally, Ezekiel closed his notebook. He felt hollowed out, uncertain, profoundly shaken. I need time to think about all this. Take what you need, Adalia said. I'm not going anywhere. Ezekiel stood, descended the porch steps. He paused at the bottom, looking back. Did any of them haunt you? The people you killed? All of them? Adalia answered simply. Every single one. He nodded slowly, then turned and walked toward the road. The evening air felt slightly cooler. Birds called their final songs before darkness. Ezekiel stopped halfway down the path, stood still, breathed deeply. His chest felt tight. His mind raced with competing thoughts, clashing moralities, impossible choices. After several minutes, he continued walking. The boarding house appeared in the distance, windows glowing with lamplight. Mrs. Henderson would have dinner waiting. The thought of sitting at a table making polite conversation, pretending normally, felt surreal. He ate mechanically when the food appeared. Couldn't taste it, couldn't remember it afterward. Then he climbed the stairs to his room and spread his notebooks across the bed. Page after page of Adalia's testimony, confessions, justifications. A century of violence documented in his careful handwriting. Ezekiel read through sections, trying to find clarity. Instead, he found layers, complexity. A woman shaped by impossible circumstances who made terrible choices that somehow still saved lives. A resistance fighter who became something darker. A protector who also became a killer. He didn't know how to reconcile any of it. As night deepened outside his window, Ezekiel realized he needed one final interview. He needed to understand Adalia's last years, needed to know how her story ended. Only then could he decide what to do with the truth she'd entrusted to him. He placed the notebook on the small table beside his bed, extinguished the lamp, and lay down in darkness. Sleep came eventually, restless and troubled, filled with fragmented dreams of faces he'd never seen, but whose deaths he'd documented in precise detail. The morning came cold despite the season. Ezekiel woke before dawn, unable to stay in bed any longer. His mind had churned through the night, replaying Adalia's words, searching for answers that refused to come. He dressed quietly, skipped breakfast, and left the boarding house while the sky still held traces of darkness. The walk to Adalia's cabin felt longer than usual. His boots crunched against the dirt road. No birds sang yet. The forest stood unnaturally still, as if holding its breath. Even the insects seemed absent. Ezekiel noticed the silence but didn't understand it. He reached the property line. The cabin sat ahead, wrapped in morning mist. No smoke rose from the chimney. Ezekiel frowned. Adalia always had a fire going by this hour, heating water for tea or preparing something simple to eat. He approached the porch, knocked firmly. Mother Adalia, it's Ezekiel Ward. No response. He knocked again, louder. Mother Adalia. Still nothing. Unease crept through him. He tried the door handle. It turned easily, unlocked. The door swung inward with a soft creak. Mother Adalia, I'm coming inside. The front room stood empty. Everything appeared exactly as yesterday. The rocking chair, the small table, the trunk against the wall. But the stillness felt different, heavier, final. Ezekiel moved toward the bedroom. The door stood partially open. He pushed it wider, stepped through. Adalia lay in bed on her back, completely still. Her eyes were closed. Her hands were folded across her chest, resting on a cloth-wrapped bundle. Her face looked peaceful, almost content. The harsh lines that usually marked her expression had smoothed away. Ezekiel stood frozen in the doorway, his breath caught. He knew immediately what he was seeing, but his mind refused to accept it for several long seconds. Mother Adalia. His voice came out barely above a whisper. She didn't move, didn't breathe. He forced himself forward, approached the bed slowly, reached out with a trembling hand and touched her forehead, cold, not the warmth of sleep, but the absolute chill of absent. She had passed sometime during the night, peacefully from the look of it. No signs of struggle or pain, just a body that had carried too many years and too many memories finally deciding to stop. Ezekiel sank onto the edge of the bed. His chest felt tight. Tears stung his eyes, though he couldn't quite explain why. He'd known this woman for less than a week, but somehow she'd become essential, a fixed point in a confusing world. His gaze fell to the bundle beneath her folded hands, cloth wrapped around something rectangular. He hesitated, then carefully lifted her hands and set them gently at her sides. He unwrapped the cloth. Inside lay a leather-bound ledger and a sealed envelope with his name written across it in precise handwriting. Ezekiel opened the envelope first. The letter inside was brief, written in the same careful script. "Child, you carry the weight of truth. Now use discernment. Truth is a blade. Cut only what needs cutting. I've given you the full account. Every name, every reason, every date. You'll decide what the world needs to know and when it needs to know it. Don't make me a hero. Don't make me a monster. Tell it exactly as it happened, and let people wrestle with what justice looks like when law provides none. I'm trusting you because you understand complexity. You ask hard questions. You don't settle for simple answers. Do right by the story. Do right by the people who died, both the ones I killed and the ones I saved." Adalia. Ezekiel read it twice. His hands shook. He set the letter aside and opened the ledger. The first page bore a single line in bold letters. The accounting, what followed, filled page after page, dates, names, detailed circumstances, motivations. Each entry methodically recorded, organized chronologically from 1829 to 1915. August 17, 1829. Benjamin Hatcher, overseer, fell into well reason, whipped Sarah's infant son to death for crying during his dinner, threatened to do the same to other children if they disturbed his peace, loosened well stones 2 days prior. Natural collapse appearance, March 3, 1833. Catherine Bellamy Rhodes, mistress's cousin, thrown from horse reason. Forced herself on Jacob, age 14, repeatedly threatened his mother with sale if she spoke. Spooked horse with hidden thorn during hunt. Appeared accidental. November 12, 1847. Dr. Samuel Crane, plantation physician, fever infection. Reason performed brutal medical experiments on enslaved women without consent. Altered his medication gradually over 6 weeks. Mimicked natural illness. The entries continued decade after decade. Each one precisely documented. Each one tied to specific harm caused and lives protected. Ezekiel turned pages slowly, reading every word. The chronology revealed patterns. Most deaths occurred in clusters during periods of extreme violence, right before planned auctions after particularly brutal overseers arrived when white supremacist activity increased. The later entries showed subtle changes in tone. Adalia's handwriting remained steady, but the words themselves carried weariness. June 8, 1912. Thomas Reed, businessman, heart failure. Reason collaborated with white vigilante groups, provided information leading to 3 disappearances, confronted directly, given opportunity to cease activities, refused and threatened exposure, administered gradual poison mimicking cardiac episode. Note, this one weighs heaviest. Killing our own feels different, but corruption inside is poison, same as violence outside. 3 families safer now. Still, I am tired. The final entry came in 1915. April 22, 1915. Edgar Thompson, sheriff's deputy. Accident during arrest. Reason targeted young black men for false charges. Used position to extort families. Created situation where he fell during supposed arrest attempt. Last one. I am too old now, too tired. Let others carry this burden forward if they must. I have done enough. Ezekiel sat beside Adalia's body for hours. He read every entry, traced the arc of her life through the deaths she'd caused, saw the deliberation, the careful planning, the constant assessment of threat and necessity. He also saw the cost. Notes scribbled in margins revealed her internal struggle. Another life taken, another piece of soul lost, and later. How many more before I rest? And finally, near the end, I want to stop. I want to believe the world has changed enough, but I see the same patterns, the same threats, the same absence of justice. The ledger contained 83 documented deaths spanning 86 years, each one justified, each one weighing on her. Ezekiel closed the book carefully. He sat in silence, listening to nothing. Outside, the morning had fully arrived. Sunlight filtered through the window, warming the room slightly. He looked at Adalia's face, peaceful, free, finally from the terrible burden she'd carried. Ezekiel stood slowly. He had responsibilities now. Neighbors needed to be informed, arrangements needed to be made. But first, he needed to honor her body properly. He found a quilt in the trunk, hand-stitched, beautiful despite its age. He spread it gently over Adalia, covering her completely, tucking the edges carefully. Then he walked outside. The forest had come alive now, birds singing, insects buzzing, wind moving through leaves. The unnatural stillness had broken. He found Mrs. Washington 3 houses down the road. She listened quietly as he explained, then nodded. "I'll gather the women. We'll prepare her properly." News spread quickly. By mid-afternoon, several older women had arrived at the cabin. They washed Adalia's body, dressed her in clean clothes, arranged her hands again across her chest. They worked with solemn efficiency, speaking little. Ezekiel helped where he could, fetched water, moved furniture, stood back when not needed. One woman, ancient herself, paused beside him. "She was good to many people, delivered my daughter, saved my husband once when he took sick." She looked at Ezekiel directly. "Whatever else she was, remember that too." He nodded, unable to speak. By evening, Adalia lay in a simple pine coffin built by 2 men who'd appeared silently to help. Tomorrow they would bury her in the small cemetery at the forest's edge. Ezekiel walked back toward town as the sun set. He carried the ledger pressed close to his chest, wrapped again in its cloth. The letter stayed folded in his pocket. The weight of both felt enormous, heavier than their physical mass. He'd been entrusted with a century of secrets, with truth that could destroy reputations or illuminate hidden resistance. Cut only what needs cutting. He still didn't know what that meant. Didn't know how to shape the story responsibly. But he understood now that Adalia had chosen him carefully, had tested him, had decided he could handle the complexity without reducing it to simple judgment. The boarding house appeared ahead. Lights glowed in windows. Normal life continued inside. Dinner, conversation, routines unmarked by the seismic shift occurring in Ezekiel's understanding of justice and history. He climbed the steps slowly, entered quietly, and went directly to his room. The burial happened at dawn. Simple, quiet, attended by fewer than a dozen people, mostly elderly women who'd known Adalia in passing or received her help decades ago. No preacher. Adalia had requested none, just words spoken by Mrs. Washington about a woman who'd lived longer than anyone should have to, who'd carried burdens no one else could see. They lowered her into earth at the forest's edge, where wildflowers grew thick and sunlight filtered through leaves. The coffin settled with a soft thud. Ezekiel helped shovel dirt, each scoop feeling heavier than the last. By mid-morning it was finished. A simple wooden marker, her name carved carefully. Adalia, born unknown, died 1937. She endured. Ezekiel walked back to the boarding house alone. His hands still smelled of fresh earth. His clothes carried dust from the grave. Inside his small room, he sat at the narrow desk and pulled out the ledger, placed it beside his interview notes, stared at both for a long time. The morning light showed every detail clearly, the careful handwriting in the ledger, his own hurried scroll in the notebook. 2 versions of the same life, both incomplete on their own. He could write the story as confession, send it to authorities, expose Adalia as a murderer who'd operated for nearly a century. It would make national news. People would debate her morality endlessly, reducing her to a symbol, either monster or martyr. Or he could bury it entirely, destroy the ledger, file a simple WPA report about an elderly woman who remembered plantation life, and let her secrets die with her. Neither option felt right. Ezekiel stood and walked to the window, watched people move through the street below. Normal lives, simple concerns, none of them wrestling with impossible moral questions. Truth is a blade. Cut only what needs cutting. He returned to the desk and began writing. Not the full confession, not the sanitized version either, something between, something that honored complexity. He wrote about Adalia's childhood on Bellamy Plantation, the systematic cruelty she witnessed, the impossible choices enslaved people faced daily. He described her intelligence, her observation, her gradual realization that no external justice would ever come. He wrote about the hidden network of women who protected their community through knowledge and careful action, about decisions made in darkness when law provided nothing but oppression. He wrote about Reconstruction's false promises and the ongoing violence that made freedom feel like just another form of captivity. But he didn't name specific victims, didn't provide dates for individual deaths, didn't turn her testimony into a criminal record. Instead, he shaped it as a narrative about survival, about the extreme measures oppression forces onto human beings, about what happens when an entire system denies justice to those who need it most. He worked for 3 days straight, barely eating, sleeping only when exhaustion forced him. The WPA required official documentation. He provided it. A standard interview summary noting Mother Adalia's advanced age, remarkable memory, and detailed accounts of plantation life during slavery. Accurate, professional, unremarkable. The deeper truth, the ledger, the full interview notes, his own analysis, he placed in a separate folder. He labeled it Carefully Sealed Archive. Mother Adalia, complete testimony for historical preservation only. He locked it inside his WPA case with a note. Contains sensitive material regarding systemic injustice and community protection during slavery and Reconstruction. Recommend delayed release until appropriate historical context can be provided. The case would go to the WPA Central Archive. Someday, maybe decades from now, researchers would find it. They'd have the full truth. Then, when enough distance existed to understand it properly, for now, he'd preserved both the story and the people it might affect. Ezekiel finalized the paperwork on a Friday afternoon. He mailed the official WPA summary and locked the case for archival transfer. His hands shook slightly as he sealed the envelope. The following week, he received a new assignment, interviewing former slaves in Alabama. He accepted it and began preparing. But something had shifted inside him. He started asking different questions during interviews, went deeper, listened more carefully, pushed past comfortable narratives to reach harder truths. Other WPA workers noticed his reports became longer, more detailed, more nuanced. He documented not just facts but context, not just events but systems, not just individual stories but collective patterns of resistance. Within a year, his supervisors recognized him as exceptional. They assigned him more complex interviews, trusted him with sensitive subjects. Ezekiel moved through the late 1930s with new purpose. Every interview became an opportunity to preserve what would otherwise be lost. Stories of suffering, yes, but also stories of intelligence, strategy, and survival that complicated simple victim narratives. The 1940s brought war and social change. Ezekiel transitioned from WPA work into academic historical research. He became an archivist, then a professor, then a leading voice in preserving Black oral histories. He taught students to approach testimony with respect for complexity, to resist the urge toward simplification, to understand that people living under oppression develop survival strategies that don't fit comfortable moral categories. He never mentioned Adalia specifically in his public work, but her lessons guided everything he did. The years accumulated. 1945, 1948, 1950. Ezekiel's hair grayed at the temples. His body moved slower, but his mind stayed sharp, his commitment unwavering. In 1952, he returned to Mississippi for the first time in years. He drove to the small town where Adalia had lived and died. Found the cemetery at the forest's edge. Her grave sat beneath a large oak now, wildflowers still growing thick around it. The wooden marker had weathered but remained readable. Ezekiel knelt slowly, joints protesting. He placed fresh flowers, white lies, at the base of the marker. For a long moment, he just stayed there, one hand resting on the earth above her. "Your truth lives, Mother Adalia," he whispered. "When the world is ready, they'll hear it." He stood carefully, brushing dirt from his knees. The forest around him felt peaceful. Birds sang. Wind moved through leaves. No unnatural stillness, no hovering dread, just a quiet resting place for a woman who'd carried impossible weight. Ezekiel walked back to his car slowly. He didn't feel burdened anymore, didn't feel crushed by the responsibility she'd given him. Instead, he felt purpose, clarity, a sense that his life's work had found its proper direction because of her. I hope you found that story powerful. Leave a like on the video and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. I have handpicked 2 stories for you that are even more powerful. Have a great day. 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 Have a great day.